Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the special shave and a haircut edition, the shave and a haircut edition of the bathtub. We don't have it very often around here, and it's also I realize it's the I don't remember if I mentioned this. This is the slightly better calibrated bookshelves edition. So I don't know if you've noticed, my shelves have been growing over the course of the couple of years we've done these talks, and for some reason, some idiot put those shelves in over there. They were just idiotic, and it looked like an earthquake about to happen. So I brought in the production people, and they fixed it up a bit. So I may have already told you this. I'm losing my mind slowly. So today we're in the I think this is the third episode of reading the novels of William Trevor and Brian Moore backwards. So it's just I don't know, it's just totally arbitrary chore we've set ourselves. It's not a chore, it's just sort of a way of organizing reading these books because I've read every Brian Moore book probably 3 or 4 times. And I've read all of Trevor's short stories and not really read his novels, which definitely deserve to be read and do not have as good a reputation as the short stories because they're not quite as sharp as the stories, but they're really good. And so I'm reading backwards, and I haven't read almost most of the Trevor novels, and it's an interesting way of doing it. I thought we'd start with the Trevor. This is a real interesting volume to get. You may know that I generally prefer, I'm trying to get rid of all my old hardbacks and kind of stick with the old mass market paperbacks. I've decided no other book, you should not read books in the bathtub unless they're mass market sized paperbacks. But some writers you really want to keep around and see the original editions of their work. This is a very interesting edition of Trevor. It's called Two Lives. It came out in 1991. And my theory of Two Lives is that Trevor wrote pretty much a book a year. So a book of short stories and then a novel, almost alternately. It was a sort of a wise plan. You'll see T.C. Boyle we talked about. He sort of does that. He does the short stories while he's writing the novel. And this one, his even successful literary writers don't sell that well. My theory is that even if you're like a publisher of one of the great novelists of the past 50 years, you're not like thrilled to get this latest novel by William Trevor. That's my personal theory. So they would get these books of his, and they couldn't get them out quite as fast as he was writing them, and they weren't all going to be made into big miniseries on TV. I'm pulling the old label out. I hate old labels on books. I didn't realize this was here. So basically, he kind of got behind. He has it was published as two novellas, which is, I don't know why they say that. I think they even say it it's basically two novels in one volume. And they're both really good. These are two of the best novels I've read by Trevor. The edition comes out in 1991, and there's two novels in here. One's called Reading Turgenev. Please don't write me. Turgenev. I always say Turgenev. And another story called My House in Umbria. And they are both standard-sized Trevor novels, a couple hundred pages apiece, very focused on one life, one individual, really, possibly in a social situation. And the first one, Reading Turgenev, I thought I'd bring out a couple of volumes of Turgenev because this guy is one of the great classics for the bathtub, by the way. So we'll talk a bit more about him in a minute, and we're going to take him into the bathtub soon. And Reading Turgenev, these mid to late Trevors are really interesting to read in comparison to mid to late Brian Moore novels. Trevor starts off, as I mentioned, a lot wilder, a lot more energetic, a lot more genre bending. He bends genres. He plays around with horror stories and fantastic stories occasionally, and his stories are much more comic, the early ones. And he starts off a little more surprising writer. And mid to late life, really melancholy books. Quite sad, quite moving, and they're absorbing from the first page. The very simple plot of Reading Turgenev is a young, again, Irish girl she's a Protestant girl in in Dublinish area. I don't know. She's out in the countryside, not Dublin. She's out in the countryside. She's in a Protestant area where some of the old animosities between the Protestants and the Catholics are breaking down a bit. And she lives in a very kind of insulated Protestant community, Protestant family. And she, because her options for marriage are pretty small, she has a small little village which is basically run by little Protestant businessmen. And she marries a man who's much older than her. It's a very unromantic relationship, and the book really much starts. Again, one of the things that's similar between Trevor and Moore is they always know when to start the book. So it starts really with her meeting this man who's a little older than her, who's sort of a nice guy, and it has one of these really awkward sexual situations that Trevor writes about. Again, very different from Moore, whose books become quite sexual, quite even erotic. Some of these later books, sex in Trevor is always kind of is a bit of a bummer. It's always a bummer. And this girl marries this guy who's older than her, and on the wedding night they go to some horrible beachside resort, and they go into a pub, and they get drunk, and they go back to the room. And what really clearly happens is that this sorry, I'm wiping stuff off my face now. I don't know what that is. They go back to the room for this honeymoon night, and I think basically the guy gets drunk and falls asleep. And what it seems to be is they never have sex after this. They have no sex life, and she never gets pregnant. And they're both bored with their lives, but she's a very melancholy, kind of quiet, insular girl. And one day, after a few months of the marriage, she goes off to see her cousin, who was a sick man, a young boy who was very sick when she knew him as a kid. And she had a romantic feeling for this cousin of hers. And she wanders off to see this young boy who's still sick and still living with his mother. And this is the blow your nose part of the episode. And she goes off to see her cousin, and rekindles this kind of romantic feeling for this young boy. And he basically sits around the house. He can't leave the house very much because he's very ill. And they go sit and lie in the graveyard together and read Turgenev. He has like 4 books of Turgenev. And I think one of them's Home of the Gentry, and Torrance's Spring is one of the great short romantic novels. Really sad, melancholy, Trevor-like romances. And they read these books together, and then about a few months after she sees her cousin again, he dies of this disease. The rest of the book is about her growing more and more absorbed by her relationship with this young boy. She completely pushes away from her husband and her family. And I don't want to tell you more than that, but it's about a girl who becomes totally isolated and what happens to her over a long course of her life. It's a beautiful book. It rivals Turgenev for the sadness and the melancholy nature. It's not as sharply. I've never thought Trevor's not a really sharp writer like Turgenev or Brian Moore, but he draws you in page after page. It's one of my favorite Trevor novels. My House in Umbria is also another lovely, a little more comic, a little lighter. It's about a woman who was adopted, and she's had a really weird background too, and she's gone off to become a romance novelist, and she gets involved in a terrorist attack in Italy. It's called My House at Umbria, and this is about her relationship with 3 other survivors of the terrorist attack, who she takes home to this big house that she keeps, and where she actually takes in holiday makers occasionally. And it's a funnier book, lovely book, 2 of his best books. It's one of the nice things about reading these backwards is you don't miss anything, and you can kind of sort of see these sweeps of the writer's abilities. Last episode we talked about Lies of Silence and Color of Blood. The late Moore. That's a period with the late Moore where he really he takes a lot of his Hitchcock experience. He worked with Hitchcock, and he drives right into as thriller territory as he can get. And he never cheats. So these are really, really good thriller novels, like The Statement, which is probably the best of that series, and The Color of Blood and Lies of Silence, which are focused on one character, one third-person viewpoint, and a very dramatic series of situations. You can't put those books down. Before Color of Blood, Moore wrote one of my favorite books. We did a separate episode on Black Robe, where he starts to wind up this thriller material. And it's a historical novel about a Jesuit who goes to enlighten the natives of Canada. Great thriller. And before that, we're going to talk a little bit about two of my favorite. We're getting into my favorite period of Brian Moore, which is really that mid to late period. His late stuff is great, but he's really experimenting with form and what kind of stories he's telling, and they're really surprising books. Again, we talked about it. When you get to the beginning of Moore, he's sort of the opposite of Trevor. His early books are really good dramatic stories, but they're very realistic. They're they're very melancholy characters, and in very insular provincial environments. And unlike Trevor, he starts to open up into this kind of international, very funny, thriller-ish, suspenseful narratives. And he plays with his genres quite a bit. Cold Heavens, a great thriller. And it's a metaphysical thriller. I will tell you very how it starts is a woman is off with her husband. She's a lapsed Catholic, like many more characters. She hates the Catholic Church. Many more characters like this walk away from it, hates all the bullshit of the Catholic Church. She's out. Her husband gets hit by a boat. This is based on an incident that happened to Moore, I understand, from Brian himself. Here's my signature from my old friend Brian Moore. And it happened to Brian. And the narrative character he dies. He goes to the hospital. They put him in the morgue. He's dead. And the wife goes home, and she finds out he's been there. And it's basically from the first chapter, this guy has come back to life. Some sort of Lazarus event has happened, and this guy has come up from the dead. It doesn't go into zombie-ish. You never turn into people driving stakes through everybody's heart. It never turns into Stephen King bullshit. He takes that one idea, and he takes it very far. He takes that idea very far, but it's almost entirely realistically narrated. Terrific read. Really, really strong book. One of my favorite Moores is just before that. And this goes back to some of his early books, The Temptation of Eileen Hughes. I love this book. Again, he sets it up very quickly. And I'm trying to remember. It starts off with this man and his wife checking into a motel in London. Big fancy hotel. And they're from Belfast. They're from Belfast in Northern Ireland. And he's a businessman. He's taking his wife and a girl who works for him for a week holiday he takes every year. And he's developed a kind of, quote, mentor relationship with this young girl who's a very plain, boring girl. She's not a very interesting character in many ways. And she's the point of view for the most part. And very quickly, within the first few chapters, she starts to look around. She's very enamored of this couple. They're very glamorous, and she's going to London, and she's all excited. And these two people are really nice to her, and they're like the parents, these glamorous parents that she gets to hang out with. And she starts to realize that there's something weird in their relationship. The wife is off picking up men in the bar while the husband's off doing whatever he does. And the husband clearly is obsessed with this young girl, Eileen Hughes. That's how it starts. This is a great read. And again, it's very tied up in the relationships between these three people, but it reads like a thriller. You cannot put the book down. So two of my favorite Brian Moore books, and which will always be two of my favorite William Trevor books. And we will talk just briefly to say that Turgenev is one of my favorites. I've been collecting these old collected editions of the early hardback translations by Constance Garnett, who's often unfashionably treated as being treated as unfashionable, but I've always liked her translations, and they're lovely little sets. And this is Torrents of Spring and First Love, two of the great Turgenev books. We'll talk more about Turgenev one of these days because I want to reread all of these. I've read all of these a couple of times too. Home of the Gentry, just two random copies. You definitely want to read some Turgenev in the bathtub. This is a lovely copy. I have all these books. This was a box set of the old Brian Moore novels that came out in the 90s, I believe. Temptation of Eileen Hughes, Catholics, I Am Mary Dunn, Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn. Not the best illustrations in a way, but I don't know, they sort of capture something about Moore's books. It's a lovely little trade paperback box set I can't get rid of because I like it, just have it. All right, so there's our latest edition of Trevor and Brian Moore, reading them backwards, and read them any direction you want, read them randomly. You can't go wrong, and we're in a really good streak for the Moore novels, and I'm really enjoying discovering all of these Trevor novels. Okay, bye.